Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Jason Hernandez. Our talk is titled Tracking Spies in the Skies. As you can see there, that's a photo of a domestic surveillance aircraft, N496WW, which is an FBI aircraft that was flying over the Phoenix area over the last couple of years. So again, about the talk, our main focus is on law enforcement and aerial surveillance, mostly focused on domestic flights. So the FBI, the DEA, local sheriff's offices, and police departments. They're all operating fixed wing and helicopter aircraft with a variety of technology. Sam Richards is going to lead off with a little bit of the discussion of the history of aerial surveillance and the discovery of the FBI and DEA's secret fleets. And then Jerod, MacDonald, Evoy is going to talk about some of the technology aboard the aircraft. And then I'll finish up and discuss some algorithmic ways to detect aerial surveillance based on flight patterns. So over to Sam.
All right. Well, thank you again, everybody, for coming out here. This is crazy. So I want to say right away that it's a huge topic, obviously, with tons of different agencies and municipalities and technologies. So this isn't going to be all-encompassing, but we're going to try and do as best justice as we can to the topic. So I guess for me, it started off a long time ago, just interested in all kinds of conspiracies, really. The closest one that you can think of with this would be the black helicopter conspiracy. So people were suspecting some sort of government activity with unmarked aircraft flying all over the place. Nobody really knew if there was actually something to it or not. And it turns out that there was, interestingly enough. And so the first news report that kind of caught my eye and a lot of people's attention was from the Wall Street Journal. Just like on a lot of these initial reports, it was just talking about one individual plane, and it was pretty obvious that you could assume that it would be doing some sort of surveillance. And then when Baltimore happened with the Freddie Gray protests, more people started noticing just a single-engine Cessna circling at, a lot of times it was at night, and it was pretty obvious to assume that that was monitoring the protests because the plane wasn't there before that. And again, with those articles, it was just referencing one aircraft. Nothing really confirmed. It wasn't ever acknowledged publicly by the agencies that were operating the aircraft, obviously. And that's sort of when I started getting involved. So I put a story on Medium.com. Initially, I was just on my Twitter account. I got a tip from somebody I worked with at Minneapolis International Airport. He just sent me a screenshot from Flight Radar 24, and it showed just this plane circling all kinds of, I think it was Southdale Mall in Minneapolis and other highly populated areas. So we immediately recognized that it was doing some sort of surveillance there. And we just, all open source information, we just pulled the aircraft's registration up on aircraft1.com. And from there was a list of 62 planes that had similar registration. So that plane in particular was registered to FVX Research, which, doing just more open source investigating, you could see that that wasn't a real company. They weren't on any Secretary of State websites. There was no legitimate business website or anything like that. So at the bottom of that first list we found were 2 aircraft registered explicitly to the Department of Justice, not behind a front name, just explicitly DOJ. And those 2 planes were actually 737s, so not the kind of aircraft that are used for spy planes, but still it was interesting to see that correlation right away. And then from there, using just the names of these companies that we couldn't prove existed, I just started searching all those specific names like PSL Surveys, FVX Research, Northwest Aircraft Leasing Co. is one of my favorites. And putting those names into these little aircraft registration websites, the list ballooned to over 100 aircraft. And this was in May of 2015. So I put that list on Pastebin, which I'm sure people are familiar with. It's just like a website you can just dump information on and share it. So at that same time, I just put a little brief, write-up like hashtag FBI Sky Spies. This is probably what's going on. Here's some links to images from flight radar where you can see these planes circling. And it was all over the country. Like Seattle was really heavy at that time, but basically anywhere there was a metropolitan area that's bigger than a medium-sized city, but also rural places too, like remote places. Greeley, Colorado, outside of Denver, was a really small town that was popular with the FBI at that time. And yeah, you can go next. So this was basically my main concern with these planes. I knew about this program from a PBS documentary. Basically, the drones in this case, they patch together what are equivalent to just a ton of cell phone cameras. And you make an image so large that you actually you keep these drones parked over for a long time, and then you can see everything moving, including people walking, cars and things like that. And so in the war efforts, they were using these to try and track down who placed an IED somewhere after the bomb exploded. And they would literally just review the footage and find where that person went. And then presumably the special forces or whatever would raid that house. And so that was publicly known, developed by DARPA in the early 2000s. And that was when I saw planes flying over the country, I immediately thought of this technology. And so that's a huge fear, obviously, if you have everybody in a city being surveilled with all their movements being tracked. So a little bit more on that technology later on probably, but back to the story. So after I put up my story on medium.com, it was just like less than 1,000 words. The Associated Press broke that story into the mainstream about a week later. And so those tweets with the flight tracking information and the Medium blog posts were going viral still. So that was interesting. They actually linked to it in the AP article initially. They called it speculation, which didn't really hurt my feelings that much, but let's see here. So continuing on to the research, we basically found this office at the FAA's FOIA headquarters, and you can submit a ton of tail numbers. They were actually incredibly responsive and helpful. This one came from a FOIA that I sent over 700 tail numbers to them, and they came back with just a massive spreadsheet in not much time at all. And you can kind of see the basic info, like the tail numbers are highlighted. You see the dates, the airport cities that they took off and landed at, but not a whole lot of information. So you don't see the circles or if it was just a simple A to B flight, but you get a general idea. And so that was helpful, but still sort of limited. If we're going to go about trying to investigate these things, just doing it manually on a flight radar website or doing it through public records requests, it's very labor intensive. And with hundreds and hundreds of these aircraft, which are actually proliferating down from, you can hit the next one. Or maybe the next one, we'll go back to this one. So you can see that these companies that are making this technology, it is an industry, it's surveillance industrial complex. Initially, everything starts off with the war efforts, it seems, and then it eventually percolates down from there from federal to state to local. And the bottom there, it says large city law enforcement, medium city law enforcement. That's a huge market share. So we're going to clearly see this type of stuff continue to be, even just some podunk sheriff will eventually have a Cessna with whatever capabilities. So we need more people to look into it, because looking at one plane, if you pull it up on flight radar, you'll see just a bunch of flights, right? And that's obviously labor intensive. So I think people need to start taking it seriously and trying to kind of inquire more with whoever's operating the aircraft in their neck of the woods. So you want to go back to that one. This is really interesting to me. So this was actually made by Homeland Security's geospatial intelligence team. And, you can see the red areas. I'm not sure how clear it is on the screen over there, but that's where there was civil unrest, the Freddie Gray protests response, basically. And then they have all the other critical infrastructure that they're interested in protecting. So this wouldn't really be possible without some sort of spy plane overhead. You feed this down, and obviously it's a huge benefit for any law enforcement or intelligence to have a pretty accurate and up-to-date map of an entire city and all the activity at the time. And then you want to keep going. Let's see. Yeah.
So I've been looking into what the types of different aircraft through public records, and through public records we've been able to, and just watching, flight radar, we've been able to determine what types of aircraft they use. The most common for airborne aerial surveillance are the small fixed-wing Cessnas. It's like a one-engine prop plane. You probably have seen them around. They're really popular with like flight schools or private owners. But they'll fly those around all over. A lot of law enforcement has those, both local and state and federal. Then the next type of aircraft, these large dual-engine Beechcraft. It kind of looks like this plane right here, but instead of one engine up front, it's got two on each wing, and it can hold like about 15 to 20 people. Now, when they go to like the state legislator and ask for money to buy these, they usually say, oh, it's going to be for transport or things like that, or moving investigators around the state. But when you go through the records, you find that they do have surveillance equipment installed on them as well, and they're using these large engine planes. Specifically, Customs and Border Patrol has one that they fly up and down the border almost daily around Arizona and Texas, just running surveillance on the border, picking up radio signals and things like that. Then there's the military-style plane, the Pilatus. Very, very few law enforcement have these. Phoenix PD is one of the early adopters that we know of. And what's interesting about this specific plane, it's the Spectre model, which was initially designed for the U.S. Air Force to fly and do surveillance in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, the other interesting thing about this plane is, first, it's the largest one-engine prop plane you can buy, and it's also pressurized. Now, if you have a pressurized cabin, you can go up way higher. And this plane is usually flying at around 17,000 feet, doing circles, like 10-mile orbits, following some guy or looking at a residence. So these are becoming more and more popular. This is about like a $4.5 million aircraft, though. So the larger cities are going to be the ones that are going to be more interested in the Pilatus. But the small fixed-wing Cessnas, I mean, there's not a huge barrier of entry for those for a lot of other local law enforcement because, for example, the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office down in Arizona, they got one of their planes through RICO because there was a guy who was smuggling marijuana in a plane. They found him, took the plane, and decided, hey, let's use this for our own benefit. So the other type of aircraft that most people are familiar with when it comes to police aircraft are helicopters, but they're loud, they're noisy, they got to fly low. They mainly use them for, the guy who ran away on foot or to survey like a car accident. Now, drones are still very new to law enforcement. Not very many are using them. Sheriff Joe out in Arpaio petitioned to try to get a Predator drone, but that never went through, obviously. Thank goodness. But there are other law enforcement agencies that are getting like the quadcopters. They're saying they're trying to use them for search and rescue, but we haven't really found any examples of them being used for surveillance yet, and they're a little bit harder to keep track of. But law enforcement are getting a lot more interested in those, especially with the ones that are like backpack deployable. Now, equipment-wise, the most popular type of camera system they're on practically all these aircraft is the Westcam by L3 Communications. Now, the Westcam is interesting. They have three different varieties. They have the MX-10, MX-15, and MX-20. MX-10 has like about a 70 times zoom ratio. It's usually on like the helicopters because the helicopters don't have to go very high. MX-15 is like kind of an in-between for your law enforcement agency that can't, spend $1.5 million on a camera system. And then the MX-20 is, though, the most popular. The MX-20 is the same camera system that is used on the Predator drones. They have a laser designator where they can, on Predator drones, the laser designator is used for missiles. But on a law enforcement aircraft, they use that laser designator to say they're following a guy who stole a car. They lock it on that car, and then the camera doesn't, the operator doesn't have to worry too much about moving it, and they're just doing zoom or changing the lens. Because you can see it's got like several different lenses here, and one of those lenses usually is an infrared camera. FLIR, or forward-looking infrared, the company that makes those is called FLIR, and they're the most popular. And FLIR is interesting because it's basically, imagine Predator vision. That's what it is. It's seeing heat, and it can actually see it can even see through walls, and you can see people walking inside a home with their heat signatures. But there was a Supreme Court ruling, Daniel Lee Kylo versus the United States, which ruled that using infrared to look into someone's home it requires a warrant. So this guy, he was growing pot in his house, and police looked into his house and saw there was a lot of heat coming from the garage, and then they said to the judge, oh, we think that means he's growing marijuana in there, and got a warrant. Well, Daniel Lee Kylo and his attorneys argued that the use of that infrared technology to see into his home constituted a search. And so they won that, and now the police have to get warrants to use infrared in that type of way. But it's hard to track to see how police are using that, because a lot of times cases that the aerial surveillance is used on, they'll seal the dockets. Now, cell site simulators are the other type of equipment that we know has been used on these aircraft. The FBI has done it at least twice that we know of. Now, cell site simulators, it's a little device. If you don't know, colloquially, they're called stingrays or MC catchers, and they act like a cell phone tower. So if there was one in this room right now, everyone's phone in here would go to that instead of the cell tower. And they could scoop up the data, read metadata on the more advanced versions. They can even turn it into a passive listening device. They can follow where you're going, and it's a really popular device. But if you can imagine flying one of those above a city of 1.5 million or so, you're going to be sweeping up a lot of data from that plane. Now, the fourth thing that we have seen on these planes are what they call LETC devices. Now, this is a stupid little acronym they like that we found from records, from FAA records on their airworthiness. Airworthiness records you can get, they're public record, and it shows everything that's been installed on an airplane. And we found that on some of the aircraft, they'll say installed LETC antenna. LETC stands for Law Enforcement Technical Collection. And when I reached out to Customs and Border Patrol about the myriad of law enforcement technical collection antennas that they had installed on their plane, they said that they use them to collect signals across the electromagnetic spectrum. Well, the electromagnetic spectrum's a pretty big place, right? So I asked them about that, and they just, said, no, we collect across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, which is, X-rays, gamma rays, cell phones, everything. So, but we can assume that they're using it, especially Customs and Border Patrol, probably listen to drug runners with radios or cell phones, or even internet signals could be picked up with a LETC antenna. But that's something we don't know a whole lot about yet. Now, some examples of use are, one of the most well-known examples was when the FBI flew their airplane in support of the Baltimore Police Department during the Freddie Gray protests. This is a screenshot from that. They were using IR, and they circled, I think, the protest, for like 8 to 10 hours that day. They released all the footage after myself and several other reporters kept bugging them about the footage because we knew it was their plane. So that's one of the examples of use, even though the FBI has publicly said that they don't surveil protests. But obviously they did here, but they say that that's because they were in support of Baltimore Police Department and they had asked for that. So that's the other thing, is the FBI will often lend this aircraft out to local law enforcement that might not have it. Now, another example was the FBI also did some aerial surveillance of this suspect in Arizona who they believed had been shooting a gun at cars on the Interstate 10 out there. They flew up and down the freeway, followed him to his work, and then circled his apartment, and then the next day they arrested him. So we can assume that they were probably getting intelligence on, how does he go into his house, what does he drive, where is he driving, who is he seeing, before they went in with the SWAT team and got him. Now, Phoenix PD recently used their military-style aircraft to follow a guy who had stolen a U-Haul and led police through the city. And that's another example of it being used. So it's even been used in smaller crimes like that and not just in major investigations. Now, the planes, they use front companies. Sam talked a lot about that. The FBI, CBP, DOJ, they're the main ones that use front companies. Local law enforcement doesn't really do that. But we still don't know what's on those planes. But there's a $10 records request that I encourage everyone here to do, and we will put a link to how to do this if you are curious about an aircraft. It's $10. They send you a CD the next week, and it comes with the airworthiness and registration history for the plane for its entire history. And you can look through and see what's been installed. You can see it changing hands. And an example is this plane here, I saw it doing weird patterns near the border, and it belonged to this Global Geomapping Inc., who I couldn't find any information on anywhere. They just had a P.O. Box registration in Albuquerque. I get the registration CD in the mail, look at it, literally the first page, it says, registration access, or address P.O. Box in Albuquerque, but physical address, Kirtland Air Force Base, Customs and Border Patrol. So it's pretty easy to find these planes once you kind of start learning that. But now they're catching on, and we have this problem with Delaware, where in Delaware you can register your aircraft to the Delaware Corporation Commission's office. And it just becomes a black hole and you can't get any information. For example, the Delaware Corporation Commission office has over 2,000 planes registered to that building. including Google's Ash Floyd LLC, which is their front company for their drone program that they're using to look at using drones to deliver things or update their maps. And they have about 10 Hummingbird drones registered to the Delaware Corporation Commission's office. So that's another new trick that they're using. Now, this video, real quick, this is of the Pilatus aircraft in Phoenix following a guy who had stolen a U-Haul. You can see there that they changed lenses because they have about 3 different lenses. They were orbiting at about 17,000 feet, 10 miles away. And as you can see, it's pretty clear. You can get in really close with this camera. And this is a very compressed version of the video they gave me. So I imagine that probably on their version, the clarity is even better. And you could probably read the license plate, see what state is on the side of the U-Haul and what mural they have. And right here you can tell that they're starting to designate the U-Haul with the laser designator there in order to better track it. Now I'm going to skip forward just a little bit here. See, there they changed the lens again, and in a second here they'll go to IR, the infrared, and so you'll get to see a little bit of what that does. Not sure why they went to IR on this. It was a clear day, so they might just wanted to get some good footage, but you can see the heat from the road, from the car, and you get a lot of great information for them, or they get a lot of great information with that system. Now I'm going to kick it over to Jason.
Hi, everybody, again. So we've discussed some ways to track down surveillance flights by following the paperwork, documentation, registration, but I want to look at how we more generally detect surveillance activity. Registrations can be changed and obscured. We're seeing government agencies get a little bit more clever about how they register aircraft and use shell companies. It's also possible that contractors start to get more involved in surveillance. Some surveillance technologies are commercially available. As the technology improves, more and more will, and you could see corporations conducting more surveillance. You could even see wealthy private individuals funding and conducting surveillance. And then there's also kind of a big question. We've talked primarily about the United States, but how much of this surveillance activity is happening in other parts of the world? Are agencies in the UK, in Europe, in other developed countries, or even the developing world conducting aerial surveillance of this type? And if they aren't, when will they? So I'm going to discuss some techniques to filter out surveillance flights based on taking advantage of knowledge about the technical and operational requirements that dictate relatively unique flight patterns. And as you can see there, that flight pattern doesn't look like somebody going on a commercial flight. That's have this odd corkscrew pattern, and then you can see there's a really heavily defined circle there, and whoever is at the center of that circle should probably get a lawyer. Possible, yeah. Okay, so the question becomes, how do we track aircraft? So as a hobbyist or an individual, radar is not a practical way to track aircraft. But fortunately, most aircraft are equipped with transponders that beacon a signal with a unique identifier that's actually internationally unique, issued by the International Civil Aviation Organization. The protocol is called Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, or ADSB, and it's just kind of a beaconing signal. And the positions of aircraft can be calculated with a technique called multilateration. That's where you compare the time difference of arrival for messages that arrive at multiple receivers. And you need 4 or more receivers to calculate the position of a transmitter with multilateration. Obviously, more receivers gives you a little bit better fix and better data. And there are some websites and aggregator networks that collect feeds from ADSB receivers and calculate out aircraft positions. Some aircraft also transmit additional information. They will transmit their latitude and longitude as calculated by their GPS unit, squawk codes, and altitude, but we can't necessarily rely on the accuracy of the positions transmitted by the aircraft. So multilateration is really helpful in confirming that from multiple sources. So the question becomes, how do we get a hold of ADS-B data at scale? Fortunately, there's already a large and active community of radio and aviation and hacking enthusiasts that collect ADS-B data and send it to aggregator networks. All that you need is a Raspberry Pi. Even your old Model 1B that you might have in the closet will work. An RTL SDR radio, which is a little software-defined radio. You can buy one for $25 over in the vendor area if they're not out. An antenna of varying size and quality, and an internet connection. And so for under $100, you can pick up transmissions from aircraft. And there are multiple aggregator networks that collect ADS-B data and calculate positions. A couple of the big ones, FlightRadar24.com and FlightAware.com. And then I'll talk more about ADSBExchange.com, which is a bit unique. The FAA regulations require an increasing number of aircraft to transmit ADS-B. This is part of their next-gen program to revamp air traffic control systems. So by 2020, most aircraft are supposed to be equipped with ADS-B out. And then there's similar regulations around the world in the EU, India, Australia, etc. Okay, but there are some challenges and limitations to the availability of data. The major commercial flight tracking sites augment their data with FAA radar data. The FAA gives you this data for free, but you have to accept restrictions. And the restriction is that tracking sites don't publish the positions of aircraft that are on their block list. Any aircraft owner can request that their aircraft be added to the block list for free. And even if the tracking site is picking it up over ADS-B or some other method, they're not allowed to publish it. So the commercial sites have some restrictions there. Also, bulk access to data is limited or expensive. It's not practical to get all of the data for all flights in real time from these commercial sites. But ADS-B Exchange is an exception. They explicitly do not use FAA data, and they don't censor flights. They also provide free access to live and historical data. I'd encourage anybody who uses that data to donate to them. They don't endorse us, but we are big fans of their work. So to pick surveillance flights out of that live streaming data, there's a bit of work that has to be done. There are over 80,000 flights a day. The uncompressed data coming from ADS-B Exchange works out to about 10 gigs a day. And at any given time, there's 8,000 to 13,000 aircraft being tracked in the air. Obviously, most of these are not surveillance flights. And so the question becomes, how do we pick out the surveillance flights? So, looking at surveillance flights versus other flights, we know most non-surveillance traffic goes from point A to point B as quickly and efficiently as possible. And commercial traffic and most other traffic will try and minimize flying over populated airspace, populated areas. So commercial airlines have noise restrictions. They are not allowed to fly too low over particular areas. And then furthermore, if you're in a metro area, there are a lot of different airports, including generally a large commercial airport. And each of these airports has their own ring that's controlled airspace at different levels. So this is a screenshot of the airspace around Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. And you can see that bow tie pattern is the main area of controlled airspace around the approach for the runways of Sky Harbor. And there are different altitude indicators that show that you can't fly below this range or above this range without getting clearance from the tower. So that's a hassle for a leisure pilot or commercial travel. They want to get up and out of controlled airspace as quickly as possible and not have to go in holding patterns, etc. So, and then we also know from some of the technical information about the equipment on board, there are technical and operational constraints for running surveillance flights. There's an altitude sweet spot in that if you're flying too low, you're going to make noise and you're going to be much more noticeable. You also have to deal with controlled airspace from smaller regional airports, terrain, other challenges. On the other side of the coin, most of these aircraft are not pressurized, and so they can't really get much higher than 10,000 feet, and they're not built for that. They also would have to deal more so with airspace, controlled airspace from the major commercial airport in the area. And then, just as one example of a piece of equipment, cell site simulators have a range of approximately 2 miles in a metro area, according to some documents published by The Intercept. That may improve a bit, but it gives you a good guideline in terms of range. And if the aircraft is too high, you're going to limit that range on the ground geometrically. Also, surveillance flights typically take off and land at the same airport. It just would get more costly and more impractical if you were trying to schedule surveillance flights between different airports. And so, for example, in Phoenix, the FBI uses the Deer Valley Airport, which is conveniently about 5 to 10 minutes away from the field office there. And furthermore, most surveillance is interested in people that live in densely populated metro areas. So these flights are going to be corkscrewing around over cities, not going straight from Las Vegas to New York, etc. And then there's some other items. So aircraft capabilities. Certain aircraft fly too fast. It wouldn't be practical to use a 737 to conduct surveillance over a city because it just would move too quickly. You wouldn't have much dwell time over the city, aside from costs. But then the aircraft can't be too small because they need to generate enough power or carry batteries to operate this relatively energy-hungry surveillance equipment. They also need to be large enough to carry these relatively large surveillance pods. So there's kind of a sweet spot in terms of size of aircraft as well. So with some of that information being considered, I've worked on just a prototype of a surveillance score. So where you look at the behavior of aircraft and you try and bin it out as surveillance or not surveillance. The main metric that I'm using is just calculating 90-degree turns. So that's where the heading of the aircraft changes more than 90 degrees. And each time that happens, you just increment the score. Most commercial traffic is going to only have a couple of turns, maybe to make final approach. And then it's also conditional based on altitude. So again, we know that there's generally a sweet spot for altitude. So turns and activity that are in that range are scored higher. Lower flying flights might be somebody in a flight school that's practicing takeoffs and landings. Higher up, it might be a commercial jet that's in a holding pattern before coming in. So, and then there's a lot of other angles to further improve detection. So, considering the proximity to airports and controlled airspace might help filter out more flight schools. And then scoring based on the aircraft model. Again, we have a pretty good idea. There's a good list of aircraft that are popular for surveillance and well built for that purpose. And so scoring those higher is another angle to highlight surveillance activity. Also, I think that it's suspicious to request that your plane be on the block list, and so I would highlight those as interesting potential surveillance aircraft. A little bit more geometry might help to filter out survey activity, which can sometimes trip this basic turn counting. And then comparing flights to interesting geography will also highlight surveillance activity. So, for example, Jerod found some flights that went up and down along the Arizona and U.S.-Mexico border. So highlighting the border as a interesting geographic area will help to pick out surveillance flights, because there's not really any other reason that somebody is going to fly the length of the U.S.-Mexico border. Also events like protests, the Freddie Gray protests, the protests of the shooting of Jamar Clark, and the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. We've all seen aerial surveillance, and so some scoring of those interesting areas might be another angle to highlight and spot spy planes. So just looking at that crude metric of counting the number of 90-degree turns, most flights with 30 or more turns look like surveillance flights, in that when you start to dig into the paperwork, you look where it's registered, you look at airworthiness documents, a large share of those aircraft are surveillance. So this is just an example screenshot of a aircraft over Baltimore during the Freddie Gray protests. So the prototype code that I'm going to release after the talk is takes data in a real-time live stream from ADS-B Exchange, and it pulls it into virtual radar server. ADS-B Exchange has a real-time API that VRS works with. And virtual radar server then provides a JSON endpoint that you can grab flight snippets from. The reason why I'm using that angle is that ADS-B Exchange also offers historical data that's in that same JSON format. So in the future, you could take that historical data and use pretty much the same methodology and work on refining the score and spotting historic surveillance events. So that's just loaded up into a queue, split across multiple threads that can be distributed across multiple machines. So that's helpful should one start to analyze a large archive of historical flight data. You can spin up virtual machines and just kind of crank through it. And then that's all queued up. It's composed in Redis, which has some really nice geohashing features. The surveillance flights are dumped out as JSON files into a web map. So you can look at it on the web and see these aircraft are highlighted as surveillance, or suspicious at least. And then it also archives the files into MongoDB, so you can do some geo queries and look at it further and do kind of retrospective analysis. So maybe the surveillance score algorithm, you want to improve it and tweak it, and then reprocess all of your old data and see if anything else falls out. So that's the idea there. And this will all be open source. The white boxes are code that I'm releasing. So here's an example screenshot of the web map. This is actually a very new aircraft that was purchased by the California Highway Patrol, circling over the Sacramento area. You can see it kind of does some loops and corkscrews, and then kind of goes around to different areas. I think this might actually be looking for speeders. I don't know if anybody's driven through California and they have these signs, speed monitored by aircraft. I didn't really believe it until looking at the data a bit more. So, if you're interested in this and want to work on tracking spy planes, there are a lot of things you can do. It's pretty easy to set up an ADS-B receiver for less than $100. A good little weekend project, and feed data to adsbexchange.com. You can donate to ADS-B Exchange. They don't endorse us, but you can also donate to us. The code will be open as well, so you can use, fork, and improve the application. It's still very much a prototype, but it does highlight interesting planes. So if you have questions or want to see more information, you can go to our website. We're going to have some links and article up hopefully later today once we get online, and links to GitHub soon. Thank you.
Thank you.